In this lesson, we're going to be talking about disk partitions. Disk partitions are a way of breaking an entire hard disk up into segments that may be more manageable, or you may have a particular need to store some data in one segment of a disk and a different type of data in another segment of the disk. So, for example, with Windows, maybe you want your system partition to be smaller and be kept separate from your data partition. So you may have a C drive and a D drive, even though they may both be on the same hard drive. We've actually got two partitions. I'm actually going to start here under Linux, and I'm going to show you a few things about partitions. I've got a USB stick here that I'm using to run fdisk against because I can do things with it and not worry about what I'm doing because the data on here just doesn't matter much. So it gives me a little bit of a playground. I've got a stick that's got one partition on it here. You can see it's called /dev/sdb1. And over on the right-hand side, you can see it's a Windows 95 FAT32 partition. I can actually delete that partition, and now I can create a new one. You can see here that I've got an option between doing a primary partition and an extended partition. With the primary partition, I have the ability to create 4 primary partitions. I can also do extended partitions, and I can have a number of extended partitions. What this really comes down to is whether the partition information is stored in the master boot record in the partition table there, or if it's stored somewhere else. With a primary partition, I'm actually going to store the data in the partition table inside the master boot record. So I've got a choice between partitions 1 through 4. I'm going to say partition 1, and I can say my first sector is any of these options here. And you can see it doesn't allow me to choose anything other than those options. So I'm going to say 2048, and I'll take the default here, which is the maximum. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say I want to create a 4 gigabyte partition here. You can see it defaults to a system type of Linux, and I can actually change that type. So I've got a number of different options here for the type of partition that I can put on this particular USB stick or in this particular partition. And I can mix and match my partition type, so I can have half of this USB stick be a Linux partition, and I can have half of it be a FAT32 partition. In this case, I am going to actually leave it where it is, which was a Linux partition. And now I'm going to go create another partition here. I'm going to make it primary as well. And now I'm going to change the type of my second partition, and I am going to give it a type of C. And you can see here I've got half of my USB stick is a Linux partition, and the other half is a Windows 95 FAT32 partition. Now, if I wanted, I could write this out to the partition table, and it would be there the next time I go in. So I can do, I go back into the drive and the partition table, you can see that that's still there. I can also do similar sorts of things under Windows. Under Windows, I can run a utility called Disk Part. And under Disk Part, I can get some help here. And I can select my disk. And I'm going to show my system disk here. Now I can do a lot of different things with this. I could do a format, I could create a volume, a partition, I could do a number of other things. I'm going to list my partition, and you can see there's one partition here that's 63 gigabytes in size. So I could also list my volumes, and I've got a couple of different volumes here. So there's Disk Part, which allows me to do similar sorts of things that fdisk did under Linux. Something else I can do here is go into computer management on my system, and I can go into disk management, and you can see I have a graphical version of the same sort of thing that I had with Disk Part. I can do a number of different things here. I can change the drive letter and paths, and the drive letter is something that you get with Windows that you don't get with Linux. I can bring up the properties and see the capacity, the use space, and the free space, which is something I don't get with the fdisk utility in Linux. So this disk management gives me a wider range of capabilities that I don't have with just a simple disk partitioning utility, although this is capable of creating partitions, deleting partitions, doing different things. I have the ability to resize certain partitions as well. But disk partitions is something that you need to be aware of as a forensic examiner, because you may have multiple partitions on a system, and you need to be able to look at different utilities to see what the different partitions may be on a system, so you can make sure that you're gathering all of the data that you need to gather. And you need to be able to look at a partition table or find utilities like disk management or fdisk or disk part to be able to look at the different partitions on a system that you may have and be able to figure out what the different partitions are and the different file systems that may be living on those different partitions.